Hello and welcome to Lady Dynamite Creates. This is Tiffany, and today we're going to be working on Seraphine from League of Legends. I decided I wanted to do another big project, and I wanted it to be one that had a lot of 3D printing in it. And I figured because she rides around on a little stage, I thought that would be the perfect opportunity to make a custom stand for her, and her actual stand be the stage that she uses in game. I decided to go with her base model because I was just in love with all of the pinks and purples of that design, and I love the flowing hair too. But before we jump in, I would like to ask, if you haven't subscribed already, please click the subscribe button and turn on those bell notifications so you never miss a video. And every like and comment makes a big difference with the YouTube algorithm too, so thanks. While looking through my stock box for a doll to use as the base for Seraphine, I of course am drawn to the Ever After High dolls because they're the right skin color. However, their faces are just too round for her face shape. But I was finding that the Cleo shape had a very similar nose shape and jawline as the Seraphine model has. And I figure I can use the Cleo head on the Ever After High body and have to do very minor adjustments to the skin tone. So with my base dolls chosen, I can shave off their hair with my electric shaver and then pop them down into a cup of boiled water for a few minutes until the vinyl is nice and squishy. And then I pull their heads off. I use a flathead screwdriver to scrape all of the hair plugs out of the holes, and once they're loosened, I can use my needle nose pliers to pull them out of the neck hole. Something I have noticed with the Cleo head mold specifically is that their part line is so tightly re-rooted that there's usually a small amount of tearing to the scalp there. To help get this repaired, I'm going to pop her down into some water and I'm going to boil her in the microwave for 3 minutes. This causes the vinyl to shrink up just a little bit to where the hair had previously stretched it out. This helps shrink down the holes that are too large, and while it doesn't get rid of the rips, it does allow those two sides of the plastic to come together so that it's easier to glue that area back together. And you can see those holes are much smaller now, and while the rip is still there, it's much less gaping. Using 100% acetone and cotton pads, I can remove all of the factory paint. Now I'm going to address those rips. First, I'm going to apply some liquid fusion glue, and I'm putting some on the inside of the scalp, and I'm going to spread that around with a silicone tool, and then I apply another layer of it on the outside of the scalp onto the top and spread that out nice and thin. When I'm applying the glue to the inside of the head, I'm making sure to squish it up in there so that I can feel the tip of the glue bottle rubbing against the inside of the scalp. This way I get good contact with those holes. Depending on where you look, she either has a pink or a purple ombre to her hair, so that means we're going to need to dye some hair for her. I chose to go the pink route because dealing with purple dye is a little bit trickier because it has a tendency to go gray. I plan to use Rini from the Doll Planet, and this is their high temp line, so it's safe to use this boil dye method. I get the dye simmering, and I've also rigged it up to my microwave to hang to get the ombre so I don't have to just stand there holding it in my hands. And after about 20 minutes, I pull it out, put it on a paper plate, and get outside to rinse it off. I forgot to mention that I was using Riot Dye More. This is their synthetic fabric dye, so it really permeates into the nylon doll hair nicely. I keep rinsing this until the water runs clear, and then I bring it into the house and continue to wash it and rinse it with Dawn dish soap until my suds quit turning pink. I find that the dye likes to stick a little heavier to the nylon hair than it does to yarn, so you do have to make sure you really get this out because it will stain your doll. Now let's reroot her. I've painted her scalp pink in preparation for the reroot, and I'm taking the hair and wrapping it around my finger. Then I'm going to slide it onto the reroot tool and then tighten and plunge it into the head. Since I'm doing nylon here, I'm going to try to fill in every single one of those holes. One thing to be careful of when you're rerooting, especially the part lines and the hair lines, is that you're holding the needle tool perpendicular to the line of holes. You can see this a little bit more clearly in my example photos that I'm showing. The needle prongs should be forming that T shape. If you actually have it twisted so that they're in line with the row of holes, what happens is each one of those little prongs on the tip of the needle is going into a different hole, and you're ripping the vinyl that's in between those holes. And if you do enough of those in a row, you're going to get a big split in the scalp. Now with her completely rerooted, I'm going to secure all of those hair plugs with some liquid fusion glue. I squirt a bit down into the neck hole, and then I use my silicone tool to help spread it around. I'm trying to feel through the outside of the head where the tool is touching so that I can make sure that I'm touching all of those plugs. I want to make sure they're nice and coated so that they're not going to go anywhere. Now let's work on her clothes. You'll notice in her splash art and in her in-game model that the sparkles on her shirt gradually taper off at the top. I had a really hard time trying to find some fabric that would be appropriate for a Seraphine skirt. Since I couldn't, I decided to make some. First, I created a dot pattern in Photoshop. Then I took my skirt pattern and laid this dot pattern on top of it so that it contours to the shape of the skirt. Now I've masked it off and I'm going to just start randomly erasing out some of these dots because I want it to have that gradual fade. I transfer just the dots over to the Cricut design space and I make sure that it's scaled correctly. Then I set it up to cut holographic iron-on vinyl. With it all cut out, I weed away the excess. And even though this is supposed to be the waist, this piece was just so interesting that I decided to keep this in case I can use it later for a future custom because it is a neat little pattern that's left over from the weeding. I don't know about you guys, but I find myself keeping some of the weirdest stuff thinking I might can use it in a doll. So tell me, what's the weirdest thing you've scavenged for art? Leave a comment down below. Now the heat portion of this heat transfer. I've set my heat press up to the required temperature. I'm using a Teflon baking paper to help protect the fabric. I leave it under the heat press for the allotted amount of time per package directions, and then I flip the fabric and do it on the back side. This was recommended in the directions for a good adhesion. The really nice thing about this heat transfer stuff is you don't actually need the Cricut or the heat press to do this. It just makes the job a little easier. You can always cut this stuff out by hand and use an iron. Peeling away the protective backing is so satisfying. I just love how this fabric turned out. It's just so nice and shiny. Now we skip ahead to her socks, and I've cut out 2 rectangles of fabric. I folded these and put right sides facing, and then I drew out my pattern. I did not sketch this on with any seam allowance, so I'm going to be sewing directly on that line. I take extra care along the curves and go a little bit slower just to make sure that it's nice and smooth, and I make sure to do a back stitch at the beginning and the end of my sewing. I trim away the excess, and then I use my tweezers to flip these right sides out. You'll notice later on that she has a different sparkly legging. I did decide I didn't like this fabric on this one and chose a different one. Now I'm working on the bodice of the dress, and I've fray checked all the edges of the front bodice, and I'm going to hem this V, and I'm going to sew up these 2 side darts. To hem the V, I am going to be clipping down the center here. This just allows me to neatly fold this over. Then I lock it in place with some fabric fuse glue. I use my iron to help me heat set the glue. With the darts sewn in place, I clip away the excess and use my lighter to help cinch and seal the edges. I've sewn 2 gathering threads onto a long rectangle, and a gathering thread is just a straight stitch on the longest setting on your machine. I tie off one side of the threads, and then I separate the threads on the other side, pulling on 2 of the threads that are on the same side, and this will gather up the fabric. I can now pin this in place onto the bodice and sew it down. When I'm gathering up the fabric, I am trying to make sure that I evenly disperse the fabric. This way my end ruffle is nice and consistent. To sew something that changes direction at a sharp angle, you're going to sew until you get to the point where the direction changes. Then you're going to lift up your presser foot, change the direction of the fabric, and then lift the presser foot back down and continue sewing. This will make a nice sharp angle with your stitches. With it sewn in place, I trim away the excess. I find it easiest when working with a tapered ruffle to make my piece as large as the tallest point, and then just pin it appropriately and clip the excess when I'm done. I use my seam ripper to remove all of the gathering stitches. I sew the bodice together at the side seams. I apply fabric fuse to the back of the vest pieces. These vest pieces wound up being a big pain in my butt. I'd done some experiments trying to just sew these in place, and it just never looked right and was not very clean. That complex of a shape at doll scale, it was just out of my wheelhouse. I heat set this in place while it's still on the doll in just a few select places so that I get the right curvature to the body. I don't want these to cancel out my darts that I've sewn. Once it's secure, I pull it off and do a more thorough pressing. Her sleeves are going to be made up of 3 pieces: the top ruffle, the main white portion, and the gold cuff. I sew gathering stitches onto the purple ruffles, and then I gather that up to the width of the top of the white piece. Then I sew that in place. Now I sew gathering stitches to the bottom of the white piece and gather that up until it's the same width as the gold cuffs. I fold the gold in half and bring those right sides facing and sew together. After using my seam ripper to remove all of the gathering stitches, I'm going to fold these sleeve portions in half with right sides facing and sew down the side. I use my tweezers to turn these right sides out. These are going to actually be floating from the dress because I still want her to be able to lift her arms, and if I sewed these and tacked them in place under the arms, she wouldn't be able to lift her arms anymore. I sew the bodice to the skirt at the waist seam and attach a Velcro closure. My final step is to completely ruin the dress by melting it with my iron. Yep, at some point I accidentally pushed my iron to high instead of low. This wound up being the most I have ever had to remake a garment, and I made this one a whopping 4 times before I got it right. When the cloth portion of her outfit out of the way, let's move on to the 3D bits. She has lots of buckles and buttons and gemstones and clasps all over her outfit, so I start modeling these out in 3D Max. Once I have the pieces I need modeled, I export them, bring them into a slicing software, and get them supported and ready for 3D printing. Once printed, I can prime them and give them a base coat of gold spray paint. I personally prefer to use spray paint when I'm painting things gold and silver because I feel like it has a better metallic quality. I always find that the craft paints are a little bit subpar for me, but if you have one that you really like, please comment and let me know. I'd love to try it out. Now with them base coated, I can start adding in some details. I paint the gemstones bright blue, and then I start adding shadows into the crevices, and I'm using a dark brown to do this with. And you see just that little bit of detailing is a night and day difference. Now I start adding these pieces to the dress. I'm using gem tack glue, and because it dries clear, it has less of a chance of showing on the final product. If you look carefully, you'll notice that all of these pieces have not been painted onto the backs. I find that if it's painted, it pulls away much more easily because the glue is adhering to the paint and not the surface of the item, so it'll just pop right off. Honestly, I was really doubting my abilities to make this dress after I got started. It was a little bit difficult and I was just not sure I could pull it off. After I saw it like this, I was so excited because I knew I could finish the rest of this doll. Now I'm going to make her boots, and because I haven't mastered the art of 3D printing in flexible resin, I'm going to make them out of Worbla. I 3D printed some bases I made especially for her. I made a paper pattern for the sole and the upper portion of the boot to cut out of the Worbla. I heat the Worbla up with my heat gun, and then I start wrapping it around my mannequin leg. I've wrapped my mannequin leg up in plastic wrap to help protect it because I've learned from personal experience that the Worbla will stick to the plastic of the doll. You don't want to spend your time making a beautiful shoe that won't come off your mannequin. I use my fingers and tools to help push and pull the Worbla so that it has a nice slouchy look to the fabric. When I'm happy with the overall boot shape, I heat up the Worbla sole and press this onto the 3D printed heel. Now I can heat up the boot and stick it onto the heel. I use my fingers to gently coax the Worbla into shape so that there's no gaping between the boot and the sole. I cut a slit in the back so that I can get the shoes on and off. Be extra careful cutting stuff because I had to slip up with the X-Acto blade and you'll notice the band-aid in a lot of the clips. For her choker, I've cut the pieces out of black Warbler and I'm heating those up and going to lay those on top of each other. Warbler sticks to itself, so there's no glue required. Once it looks right, I'm going to heat it up again and mold it to her neck shape. I'm very careful to make sure that I'm not pressing this into the plastic because I don't want it to stick to her neck. I use these same techniques to make her glove cuffs and her belt. Now to paint all the Warbler pieces. I have them all based out and I'm going to start adding in some detail. I'm brushing some darker browns and blacks into all of the creases on the boots. Then I hit the higher points with a lighter brown. I use hot glue to attach the boot plating to the top of the boot and the belt buckles to the belt. While I've been working on this doll, I've also been working on some new styles of shoes for my Etsy store, so I've been really busy lately. They should be going live into my Etsy shop this Friday, so you should check them out if you're interested. I have a new set of specialty heels being released, and one of the styles in this set has tentacle heels, and it's so adorable. It's probably my favorite pair out of all the ones that I've created lately. My Dynamite tier patrons receive some of these prototypes before the general public in their monthly 3D printed accessory pack. So now on to her custom stage stand. I of course can't make it completely accurate because her stage hovers and has a little bit of pointy bits on the bottom, and since it's going to be an actual stand, it has to be a little bit flatter. Elegoo was kind enough to send me one of their new Mars 3 Ultra 4K printers, and that was the reason that I chose to go with this project. I felt like this doll would have a wide enough variety of different kind of printings, from the very dainty things like the microphone to the chunkier things like the stage, so I could get a good idea on how it performs compared to what I've previously used. Overall, I'm very happy with how this printer performs. I have found some differences between how it performs compared to my original Mars, but that's to be expected because the original Mars was an RGB screen and this one is a mono. It took me a couple of weeks to find the settings that work best for me. This printer does have a higher peel force than the Mars one had, but that is to be expected with a larger print volume, so I had to make some changes to my lift and retraction speeds, and that helped with it a good deal. The only downfall to this is that I'm having to be a little bit heavier handed with my support placement. I previously have been able to get away with using mostly light supports, but because of the peel force on this one, I am having to use a few more mediums than I usually do. However, the much quicker print time and larger build plate more than makes up for that. My only thing that I really have a dislike about this printer is the front USB port. And I know there's probably no pleasing anyone with this. Some people didn't like the back, some people don't like sides, but for me, I really don't like front USB ports because I feel like they're more likely to get knocked or resin dripped on them. The USB drive that they send you is a longer one, so since this is a front port, I am going to be investing in one for myself that's a shorter one just so I don't risk damaging it with knocking it. My absolute favorite thing about this printer is this function right here. Is called the tank clean. If you ever have prints fail and stick to your FEP, you know how easily this can ruin your FEP. And so when you do a tank clean, it coats the entire FEP with a layer of resin that you can easily peel off at a corner, and you're less likely to cause gouges and scratches in your FEP because of this. I have been printing on this thing for a month. My FEP still looks brand new. It's so wonderful. Now our stage is completely printed and it looks beautiful, and we're going to start getting this cleaned up. When I'm cleaning up my resin prints, I have two different tubs of alcohol I use, my dirty one and my clean one. My dirty one is used for the initial rinsing because it's going to get the bulk of the loose resin off of the model. That way my clean resin stays cleaner for a little bit longer. Because I use my alcohol over and over again, this means that the clean resin stays cleaner longer and is less likely to leave dissolved resin residue on my prints. If you've ever seen a print that kind of looks dusty, like there's a white powder on it, this is resin residue that was left over in your alcohol that cured on your print. Because I printed this hollow, I did need to create a drain hole and an air hole on this so there was not trapped resin inside. So when I'm rinsing, I have to make sure all of that alcohol comes pouring out. Now I pour boiling water over my print, and this softens up the supports so that they're less likely to damage the surface of the model when you're removing them. Before I begin painting, I need to fix those holes, so I'm closing those up with some UV resin. I start sanding down the areas where the supports were to help remove any of the imperfections. I start with a lower grit sandpaper and get finer and finer with each pass. Be sure to wear a respirator when you're sanding these bits because you really don't want to get this resin dust into your lungs. For the saddle portion of the stand, I take an aluminum rod and I bend it into shape. I mark the spot on the stage where I'd like the stand to be positioned and I drill a hole with my Dremel. I'm not going to secure this in place because I do want this pole to be removable. It just makes for easier transport and it gives her final owner the option to have her sit on the stage rather than stand. Now she's ready for painting. I first give her a few coats of spray primer in gray and then I follow that up with the gold. Now I can bust out the acrylics and start getting all of the colored bits painted. It took me a couple of coats to get the colored portions opaque enough. I finally give the colored bits a coat of the dragonfly glaze to give it that shiny iridescent quality. I also hit all of the crevices on the gold with some brown acrylic to give it some dimension. Now onto the face up. Here's all the colors that I've used. I've used some Rembrandt and Pan Pastels, Arteza Gouache, and Mica Powder, and a variety of different brands of colored pencils. I like to use a wide variety of pencils because I find that they all have different hardnesses of lead, so they perform differently. I've masked her hair out of the way and given her a couple of coats of Mr. Super Clear UV Cut Flat and get started on her repaint. I've always heard other doll artists talk about how finicky Mr. Super Clear is, and as lucky as I am, I live in Southern California, so the weather's always really dry and warm, so I've never had any problems before. Until now. This is the first time I've ever had issues with my sealant. For some reason, my pencils just wouldn't draw, no matter what I did. Since I couldn't get any coverage off the pencils the normal way, I decided to use a wet brush and lift the pigment directly off the pencil. I'm not really great at getting fine lines with a brush, so I am using a wet brush and a Q-tip to help refine some of the lines. I apply a layer of pale peach pastel so that I can start shifting her skin tone closer to Seraphine's. I give her another coat of Mr. Super Clear and get started on layer 2. This layer did have better tooth, but it still wasn't what I was used to working with, but I powered through and kept going. I sketch in her iris shape and her pupil placement, and I add some darker reds to the corners of the eyes. I fill in the whites of her eyes with a creamy white watercolor pencil. I used to use a white pastel pencil to do this. It had a great coverage, but I didn't like the texture it was leaving behind. I discovered the Caran d'Ache, and it had a really good coverage and didn't leave behind that same texture. I begin to add some detail lines to her lips, and I go with a V shape on the top and kind of a bar down the middle. It gives the lips a more full pouty look. I lightly sketch in her eyelid crease. Now I can start doing a lot of contouring and blushing. I pinken up the apples of her cheeks and right around her eyes. I take my contouring pastel and begin to shade around her eyes, on the sides of her nose and corners of the mouth and bottom of the lips. I like to contour areas that would naturally be in more shadow and any areas that you would just naturally contour when doing face makeup. And I realize I forgot to do another lightening of her skin tone, so I'm blushing her completely with that pale pastel again. Ideally, I should have done this first because now I'm going to have to just go back and redo all of that stuff I just did. I'd like to say thank you to all of my supporters over on Patreon: Jennifer Medina, Kelly Barnard, Angela Hendrickson, Camille, Kitsy, Stormcrow Studios, Donna Magana, Bex Mini Studio, OOAK Magpie. If you're interested in becoming one of my Patreons, please check out the link in the description box below. All of my patrons get their name featured in my video, as well as access to behind-the-scenes content and work-in-progress photos. They get to participate in polls, and they're actually voting on my next doll right now. Some tiers include free clothing patterns and 3D printed accessories. I block in the colors on her eyes using 3 different shades, and I'm sorry about the jump here you're about to get because my camera battery went dead and didn't catch me adding in that one light highlight at the bottom. I was having trouble with my pencils going down, so I did use this as watercolor off the pencil. On layer 3, the first thing I do is tackle her eyebrows. I'm blushing on some pastel just to get a general shape, and then I use my pencil eraser to refine it more. Using a very sharp watercolor pencil, I begin adding in the tiny hairs to her eyebrows. I do this in a couple of different colors. Now I can move on to intensifying that eyeshadow, and I'm just using some different shades of pinks to really pump that up. I do another pass to intensify the highlights on her face. I darken up her pupils and begin to add some detail lines to her eyes. I'm doing this in shades of blue and white. I give her eyeliner another pass to make it more intense and crisp. I sketch in the signature star on her cheek. Her design reminds me a lot of Jem and the Holograms, and it makes me think that maybe whoever designed her originally was a fan of the show, because she kind of feels like a cross between Jem and Aja. I shade her eyes with some gray blue pastel for dimension, and then I slather her in mica powder. She's a pop star, so she's gotta have some glitter. I seal her and then start layer 4. This layer jumps right into contouring and highlighting. I begin to sketch in her eyelashes with a very sharp watercolor pencil, and I flip the head this way, that way, just trying to get a good angle so that I can draw these on. I try to get my pencil as sharp as I can when I'm working on lashes, so I'll first sharpen it with my pencil sharpener, and then I'll use a pencil sander to really sharpen the tip of it really fine. But you can always just use regular sandpaper too. I can now add her catch lights. I paint these on with gouache, and the ones that are the catch lights I'm doing much more intensely, but then the smaller highlights that are in the waterline and in the tear ducts, they are a much more watered down consistency, so they're not fully opaque. I do one final coat of mica powder, and then I seal her with 3 coats of Mr. Super Clear. Now to cut and style her hair, and while Seraphine overall has really nice long flowing hair, she has these framing bits that hit about shoulder length on her. I'm going to be cutting a taper on these so that they go gradually longer on the 2 front sides. I style the hair into loose curls using a chunky knitting needle and a flat iron. In hindsight, I should have waited to cut the hair until after I'd curled it. It did prove to be a bit of a headache. I would also like to remind you that I am using the high temperature hair from the Doll Planet hair, so I don't have to worry about my flat iron melting it. You should always test your hair before applying heat. I use my fingers to gently separate some of the curls and make sure to curl them back into place. What's this? Another accessory? Why, yes it is. We can't forget her hair bow. I've taken some iridescent vinyl and I've sketched out the design for her hair bow wing piece thingies, and I'm going to cut those out. There's 2 layers. There's this bigger layer and then a smaller one that has 3 small little wings on it. And I get those both cut out with the vinyl. You've seen me paint enough resin prints this time around to know the drill, so we're going to skip all of that, but I am going to drill in 2 pilot holes into the bow portion. I'll use these holes to run a wire through and attach it directly to her hair. At the time this video goes live, Seraphine will be available for purchase on my Etsy store, so if you're interested, please check out the link in the description box below. With the hair bow wired, I can now attach it to her hair, and I've just pulled a section of hair out and I'm wrapping the wire tightly around this piece. I'm going to skip to it just being done to save you with all the cursing and tangling of hair and wire and wings. With that in place, she's done and just needs to have her head reattached, and she's ready for some final photos. I wanted to thank you guys so much for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. Every like and comment always helps me so much with the YouTube algorithm, so I greatly appreciate you guys supporting my channel. Remember, always be creating.